Hello, welcome back. Today's video will be focusing mainly on the 8-mark question which resides at the end of the set text portion of paper 2 in the National 5 English exam. We will firstly revise how to go over the 2/4-mark question briefly before moving on how to best approach the 8-mark question itself. This is what the set text section of paper 2 will look like. You will have a poem and underneath it 20 marks of questions which will look like this. Paper 2 is roughly an hour and a half long. You are given 45 minutes to answer 20 marks on a Scottish author. For this example, we're going to be focusing on Carol Ann Duffy, who is a poet. As you can see, there are several questions which are only 2 or 4 marks. However, at the end of every set text paper, there will always be an 8-mark question like so, if you refer to question 40 at the bottom. This 8-mark question is different from the previous questions in the paper because instead of focusing your analysis solely on the poem featured in the exam, you'll be asked to bring in outside knowledge from the poet's other poems. For example, this exam could be on Originally, and it's asked you to bring in other poems that also explore the idea of change. We're going to go through how to answer that in this video. To answer an 8-mark question, it's important to know how to answer a 2/4-mark question first. This channel already has a more in-depth video on how to do this, which was created by Miss Thompson. I'll leave the link for that video in the description box below, so feel free to visit that video. This video, however, will briefly revise the 2/4-mark question before we approach the 8-marker. So let's get started. Step 1, it's important that you read the question carefully. You need to highlight or underline the main point of the question. If you aren't able to identify the main part of the question, you will not be able to link back successfully. Number 2, you need to look at the lines mentioned in the question and identify a technique or quotation. It's important that you stick to the lines mentioned in the question, otherwise there will be marks lost. If you quote at National 5, you will receive a mark for a correct quotation and an attempt at analysis. Which brings us to step 3. You're going to quote the word or phrase and analyse. You will not get a mark if you just quote. There needs to be an attempt at analysis in order to get your mark for identification. The analysis will not be granted a mark unless you link back to the question and you use the highlighted phrase to help you with this. Once you analyse and link back, you will receive your second mark. Say that was a 2-mark question, you would get 1 mark for quotation, 1 mark for analysis and link. If there's a 4-mark question, I recommend you doing that again or again for that insurance answer. Let's go through an example of a common mistake candidates make at National 5 set text. I will read out the question to you now. It says, by referring to lines 16 to 22, show how Duffy explores how isolated the speaker feels. We're going to go through candidate A's answer first. Candidate A says, Duffy uses a full stop, separate beds. Now theoretically she's followed the steps. She's talked about the technique and she's also quoted. She has quoted and there's an attempt at analysis. So far we can see that this candidate will receive 1 mark. The analysis says, by stating that both Mrs. Midas and her husband sleep in different beds, this shows how Mrs. Midas does not want to sleep with her husband anymore because she is angry with him. Now, before we delve into why this answer may not be the full expectation that we would like to see in National 5 English, we're going to go through candidate B's answer and we can compare. So candidate B says, Duffy uses a short sentence in line 22, separate beds. They've used the same quote. Notice how they've highlighted the short sentence rather than the full stop. And you're going to see why in a second. So we know so far that there's a quote with an attempt at analysis. So candidate B is also going to receive 1 mark. They've also attempted to analyse. They've said a short sentence is used to create a blunt and impactful opening. The bluntness and impact mimics the distance physically and emotionally Mrs. Midas feels towards her husband due to his betrayal. This short sentence shows how sudden the betrayal and separation was for the speaker and how she feels isolated from her husband now. As you can see, the analysis is a lot more in depth, but also the analysis will gain them the second mark. So we're looking for a candidate B answer rather than a candidate A answer, and I'm going to tell you why. Candidate A identifies a full stop. There is a full stop in separate beds, which is accurate. However, a full stop is very difficult to analyse, whereas a short sentence is not. Candidate B describes the technique used and why this is useful in general. They say that a short sentence is impactful and blunt. By doing that, that allows the analysis to be deepened into describing why the speaker feels isolated. If you notice, candidate A doesn't mention isolation whatsoever. Candidate A instead falls into the trap of just saying what happens at this point in the poem. There's no language analysis whatsoever, and there's also no link back to isolation. We can see there's a link back to isolation in candidate B when it says that she feels isolated from her husband now. So feel free to look at candidate A and candidate B and notice the difference. Candidate A doesn't analyse any language or link back, whereas candidate B does. After a brief revision of how to approach a 2/4 mark question, we will now explore how to successfully gain marks in the final 8-mark question of set text. How to answer an 8-mark question. Let's go through the steps just as we did for the 2/4 mark question together. So step 1, again, just the same as a 2/4 mark question, you need to read the question carefully. Highlight or underline the main point of the question on the question paper. This is important. Again, just like the 2/4 mark, you need to be able to link back throughout your answer. Number 2 is what we call commonality. That just means what do two poems have in common? The maximum you can receive is 2 marks. What you're going to do is you're going to write 2 sentences which summarise in detail why your 2 chosen poems link back to the point of the question. You're going to say, by the way, this poem's about this, and that's why it links back to the point of the question. And this second poem's about this, and that's why it links back to the point of the question. Number 3 is exam or extract. Some teachers call it different things. It doesn't matter as long as you focus on a technique in the poem given in front of you, as well as analyse and link back. It's absolutely fine. Again, you can only get a maximum of 2 marks. You want to treat this section just like you have for the previous 3 or 4 questions in the set text exam. You're going to identify, analyse and link. And number 4 is other. This is where it might get difficult. You would need to revise the other poems Carol Ann Duffy has written and be able to remember some of the quotations from those poems. Then you need to identify or analyse at least 4 to 6 different techniques from any other poem which link back to the point of the question. We are going to go through an example question together. So the question says, by referring to this poem and at least one other by Duffy, show how the poet explores childhood. So step 1 was to underline the main point of the question or highlight. I have done so. This question is asking about how it explores childhood. Number 2 was commonality. Remember, this is a maximum of 2 marks. So I've put C in the column and I've said Duffy uses language to explore childhood in both her poems in Mrs. Tilcher's class and originally. As you can see, I've told the marker, right, these are the 2 poems I'm going to speak about. Now I have to separate those poems into 2 bullet points and my summary needs to link back to the point of the question, which should be easy because I've highlighted explores childhood. So that's a little reminder to myself that that's what I need to link back to. I've said, in Mrs. Tilcher's class, Duffy explores childhood as a place of safety. This is shown through a child's loss of innocence as she discovers how babies are conceived and reaches puberty. Now the second bullet point says, similarly, and originally, Duffy explores childhood as a journey that is both slow and painful. This is shown as a child is forced to leave her home behind and learn to adapt. So as you can see, the first bullet point successfully summarises in Mrs. Tilcher's class and links back to childhood, so it receives 1 mark. The second bullet point talks about originally in a summative way and also links back to childhood, so receives the 2nd mark. You will not get a mark for just saying, I'm going to talk about this poem and this poem. You have to summarise in detail. National 5 candidates lose marks because they don't go into enough detail about why that summary links back to the point of the question. So make sure you do go into detail. You don't want to lose any marks. Step 3 was exam, so we're going to treat this just like a normal 2-marker as if it was from the first 3 questions of the set text part of the paper. So we put E, and then we say, Duffy uses the word in Mrs. Tilcher's class, appalled. What I've done here is I've told the marker, okay, I'm going to try in Mrs. Tilcher's class first. Mention the fact that this piece of word choice is from this poem. You're talking about 2 poems, so you need to be able to differentiate them clearly. I've picked word choice of appalled. Then what I need to do is I need to analyse the word choice just like I would for Rui, and I need to link it back. So I've said, by using the word appalled, this has negative connotations. The word connotes the sudden realisation, horror and shock. Duffy uses such a word to convey the speaker's feeling at discovering where children come from. It highlights her sense of innocence as it shows how physically shocked she was to hear it. This shows that the speaker felt safe and comfortable as a child, before this type of information now brought about her growing up. So as we can see, I've quoted and I've attempted an analysis. If that analysis was right or not, it doesn't matter. I still get a mark. And then the second mark comes in from the correct analysis. I've talked about the 3 connotations, I've linked the connotations back to the poem, and then I've linked the whole analysis back to the point of the question, which is childhood. So I receive my second mark. Now, I've got 2 out of 2 marks, but I don't know if that analysis is correct. So what I'm going to tell myself is I need to provide an insurance answer. This is my insurance answer. So I pick out another technique and I analyse it again, just in case my analysis is wrong. It allows me not to lose any marks. I've put, Duffy uses a short sentence in Mrs. Tilcher's class. Mrs. Tilcher loved you. By using a short sentence, it opens the stanza in an abrupt and impactful way. This abruptness emphasises how clearly obvious this fact is stated to the reader. It highlights to the reader that the speaker does not question anything and trusts her teacher fully. This emphasises to the reader that understanding complex emotions is a simple and easy thing to a child, and that there's no argument against such easy statements made, showing further how safe childhood seems to the speaker. As you can see, I've quoted an attempt and analysis. So if I failed to get marks in the previous exam, I can get the mark here. This is why it's in green rather than beige. So if I failed to get marks previously, I would get another mark. I also get a mark for the correct analysis of the short sentence there. So this would be my insurance answer, just in case. Again, I can only get a maximum of 2 marks here. So if I fail to get marks in other sections of the 8-marker, this will not win more marks. My maximum is 2. I cannot get any more than 2 for the exam section of the 8-marker. This brings us on to the last part of the 8-marker, which is decidedly the hardest part. Usually National 5 candidates lose mark here, partly because they're running out of time, but also because they do not put enough insurance answers in. I'm going to give you in detail examples of what insurance answers should look like. I put O because O stands for other. Duffy uses a metaphor in originally. Notice how I've changed the name of the poem. I'm talking about a different poem, so I mention that. I say it is a metaphor in originally. All childhood is an immigration. By using a metaphor, this shows that just as immigrants must leave their home against their will and their journeys are often perilous and scary, so too is childhood a long and tiresome journey. The speaker believes they are growing up against their free will, and it is both painful and scary to them. This highlights that childhood is a negative journey in the speaker's mind. Again, I know I'm going to get a mark because I've done a quotation that connects to childhood and I've attempted analysis, and luckily my analysis is strong enough. I talk about imagery in the correct way by saying just as this image is, so too is reality. So I get my second mark. So I've got 2 out of 4 for the section of other in the 8-mark question. Now, although I have 2 out of 4 marks, I need to continue to analyse further amounts of language. So I highlight the fact that a short sentence is used in originally, others are sudden. By using a short sentence, the speaker is emphasising that just as the sentence is short and blunt, giving a larger impact, so too are the changes that occur to a child once they grow up. The child in this poem has been forced to leave their home, and although growing up physically is slow and drawn out, the speaker highlights that changes still happen suddenly during growing up, and thus it could have a negative impression of childhood as it highlights the lack of control the speaker has over these changes. Again, I get a mark for identifying a technique in the poem, and my second mark comes from describing the short sentence being impactful, just like changes are impactful in a child's life. Now I have 4 out of 4 marks. But in an exam, I don't know that. I don't know who's going to be marking my paper. So I need to provide some insurance answers. Even if you do not have time, one insurance answer will make all the difference. The insurance answer says, Duffy uses a simile and originally. I remember my tongue shedding its skin like a snake. Just as a snake sheds its skin when it grows too large for it, so too does a speaker's voice sound different as they grow up in a different country. The speaker describes losing their Scottish accent in a manner which seems painful and uncomfortable to the reader. This further highlights that as the speaker grows through childhood, they're experiencing a negative thing. Again, if this was my insurance answer, I would get 1 mark for identifying a technique in the poem and attempting an analysis. And I also would get another mark for analysing the language, analysing it in terms of the poem, and then linking back to childhood being a negative thing yet again. So that would be an insurance answer. Again, you do not need to put too many insurance answers. 1 is enough, but it's better to be safe than sorry. I'm going to go through 1 more example of an insurance answer before we finish the video today. The last insurance answer says, Duffy uses alliteration in originally, big boys. The repetition of B sound is plosive and a hard sound. It makes the reader emphasise the vowels within the word and draws out the sentence while adding harshness. The speaker describes the boys she was forced to play beside, and the alliteration highlights the intimidation the speaker felt whilst in this new country. By drawing out the sentence but adding harsh sounds, this mimics the drawn out and harsh process of childhood to the reader. Again, alliteration is important. You want to talk about if it's soft sounds or harsh sounds. We talk about the B sound being plosive. We're analysing that language and we're also linking it back to childhood again. So we get a mark, an insurance mark for the alliteration of the B, and we also get a mark for analysing and linking back correctly. That brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has increased your confidence in tackling not only the 2/4 mark question in paper 2 of National 5 English, but also the 8 mark question at the end of the set text section. Please let me know if you have any issues, and remember to like and subscribe. Have a good day.